Well, I'm here to talk about the Web Science Doctoral Training Centre and its 5-year mission. No, actually, it's had more than 5 years. It had a 5-year mission to explore a brave new world of web science, and that was 6 years ago. We've now started on our replacement 5-year mission. If you could go on to, I don't know how this magic happens. Next slide, please. We haven't agreed. Do I click something? Ah, wonderful. Technology, don't you love it? So you know all about the Web Science Institute. You've heard about what we do, how we draw ideas and expertise across all sorts of disciplines. And what I want to introduce you to today, now in this session, is 3 of the people on our Doctoral Training Centre. So we've had one of the longest running activities in web science at Southampton has been our Doctoral Training Centre, which tries to use all of that expertise we've got across the university to focus on challenges, major challenges, cybercrime, digital inequality, the digital economy, and train PhD students and give them some really exciting experiences, and to give our partners exciting experiences. The whole effort has been funded initially by the RCUK and its digital economy programme, latterly by the EPSRC. The idea is that we're going to train a cohort of web scientists, people who will be leaders and advisors in the digital economy across the UK, will have specific and strategic kinds of understanding that will make them valuable to industry, to government, and to the academy as well. We've had some £10 million of public funding over 14 years. We will have trained about 120 students by the time we finish. We have about 60 students on our books at any one time, and they're supervised by around 100 staff we have, and each student has to have supervisors from at least 2 disciplines. So we force them into this really uncomfortable interdisciplinary partnership where they've got to generate new kinds of knowledge, and what we hope is new kinds of value in what we think of as the digital economy, the digital culture and business world and social world that we're living in. We've been looking at a number of different topics over the lifetime of our Doctoral Training Centre. The way that we observe the web and its human populations through their use of the web, social machines that we construct at large scale to try and program interventions with using the web, with all sorts of services and large populations of people, open data, big data, the future of our work, all sorts of democratic innovations, the Internet of Things. There are lots of topics there. There seem to be more and more big challenges with our online lives the longer that we hang around. For the postgrads, this marks a bit of a change in doctoral training in the UK. Instead of just telling people to sit on a chair with access to Google and occasional access to their supervisors, and then in 3 years write 50,000 really clever words on a topic, we've been trying to make them work together as a cohort, to support each other, because they all have different disciplinary expertise, different backgrounds, and also to work with industry and our partners to develop new innovations, new projects. And so they get to write a really impressive thesis and develop a really impressive LinkedIn network. So we make them take, yes, this is it, look, we make them take part in all sorts of projects and activities with all sorts of partners, thinking outside of all sorts of boxes that aren't just directly relevant to their PhD. So they get lots of experience, and we offer that out to all sorts of partners to try and work with us because academics get a very academic view of the web, and we need to understand everyone's view of the web and how they work. We've just come from a research week where we had half a dozen different projects with different external partners looking at different aspects, trying to understand, for example, for DSTL, what the melding of virtual and real world interfaces will mean for children who are growing up now. How will they experience a web? The web we experience now is nothing like the web that Tim Berners-Lee invented. It doesn't involve sitting down at a desktop workstation and in your office. It involves walking around Instagramming your food. And we've made a life out of that. And you know, we make the web, and the web changes us, and we change the web, and this process, we want to know what's going to happen with the new user interfaces. So all sorts of things that we've been going on. So we've been going on, that's not English, that have been going on, we have been initiating in a proactive way. So I'd like to introduce you to our three students. So we're going to talk about issues that they've been working with that are relating to privacy and personal data. We have Richard and Emma and Ruben. First up is Richard, who's been looking at the way in which privacy as a value is really important, and why it is that individuals don't actually operationalize that, or why don't they take any notice of their beliefs about privacy. So here, we also have Emma Craddock. Emma will be discussing the way that standard industry impinges on our experience of privacy through the standards that they negotiate for the use of data. And I believe if I click this, perhaps your slides will come up. Hey. There. Is that you?
Yeah.
Brilliant. There you go.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Thank you. Is this going to go far? Okay, yeah, so what I'm going to talk about a bit today is the need for duality between purposes and data. So when we think about consent, one really important element is what do I need to know to give consent? So if we think about consent as, Rich is going to talk about this more, but making sure that citizens' mental models match what's actually happening, or if we think about it as the inverse of surprise, then whatever consent mechanism we use, we need to think about what information this involves. So currently we're using privacy policies as a consent mechanism, so we need to think about what organisations need to tell people in their privacy policies. But as we move forward, we might think about negotiating, so we need to think about that. Or if we move to semi-autonomous agents who make these decisions on our behalf, setting our preferences, we need to think about what data we're setting these preferences over. If we move to using personal data stores, when I see a query to my personal data store, we need to think about what's going to be in there. So overall, we just need to think about what information do I need to know to not be surprised about the use of my data. So law, we've talked about a lot this afternoon, and there's this real focus in law on purpose limitations. So under the directive, the idea that personal data should be collected for specified, explicit, and legitimate purposes, and not further processed in a way incompatible with these. So when you're collecting data from the individual, this is reflected, and the law says, under the directive and the Data Protection Act, that there's two things you always need to tell someone. You always need to tell them who you are, and you also need to tell them the purposes for processing, so what you're going to do with the information. And then we've talked a bit about law, whether it needs to be certain or prescriptive. We have this nice category at the end which says, any further information as is necessary to guarantee the fair processing. So it's quite wide, and nothing that's assessed on a case-by-case basis. So anything that comes within there is not deemed to be required in every disclosure. So really what's interesting is it's not a legal requirement to tell people in every case of collection exactly what personal data you're collecting. And this might have been appropriate 20 years ago when the directive was implemented. where a lot of the data was provider data, so people were fully aware of the data they were giving. And so that might have been in the offline case of collection with a form on a clipboard, or it might have been the case in a pre-1995 web environment. But today, with the cost of data storage decreasing dramatically, and the proliferation of mobile and sensor technology, we're now collecting so much different types and amounts of data that provided data that people are aware of is really just the tip of the iceberg. And in fact, it's observed, derived, and inferred data that make up a lot of data collection and processing. And also, so this idea that we're not telling people exactly what we're getting, well, telling people what it is makes sense. If we take it, as Laura likes to do, if we use an analogy and we take it offline, if I was to take something from your house, if I was going to say, can I have this object from your house? And I was going to tell you who I am, so it's me, I'm going to have this object, and I'm going to tell you that I'm going to use it for a purpose, and I'm going to tell you things like how long I'm going to keep it for. One thing you probably want to know before you let me have this object is exactly what this object is. So that's what I'm really interested in. Also, this focus just on the purposes, it reinforces the information asymmetry, and it makes a vital check on organisations more difficult. So I'm technically entitled to know the categories of personal data that are being processed, but to do that I'd have to make a subject access request, and that involves effort, it involves time, and it involves cost, which puts an extra roadblock in the way of transparency. Also, if we just look at the purposes, it doesn't provide context to understand the implications. We really need to be linking data to purposes to do this. And just focusing on purposes alone also doesn't acknowledge that people distinguish between different types of data and information they're happy to share, whether this is rational or not. So if we take the example of type of data some people use, so employment and education details, you might be happy for me to use it for this purpose, so to provide your information to employers that might be interested in contacting you. But if I use a different type of personal data, such as your search history, some may be very happy and some may not be happy for me to pass that along to think about whether I'm going to employ you. So if we're just talking about the purposes, we really need to link the data to the purposes to provide this context and to give this transparency. We also have this situation, because we're not talking about it in the legislation, that even where data controllers do try to convey this, you normally see it in two separate sections. So it's kind of bullet pointed as it is in the Act when we're talking about use of information. And we need this link together, as I said, between actually what data is collected and what it's used for, because of how we distinguish. And this, although it's not in the legislation, has been recognised by the Article 29 Working Party. It's also been recognised by academics, and it's been recognised by the Information Commissioner's Office. So given, as we've talked about all afternoon, we've got proposals in the pipeline for a regulation, you'd think that maybe this was just a product of its time and we're going to see this change. But as I stand, it's not the case. We're not set to see this transparency. In fact, there are some proposals that might create more information asymmetry as well. So the basis of my research is, first of all, to really open up a dialogue around this. Why are we finding a legal basis in the law that isn't there for telling people this? But I don't want to just do this. I also want to think about understanding how this is work in practice. So with some of the guidance that we've had from the Article 29 Working Party, they've used differing terminologies. So they've said that people need to know what type of personal data is being processed. And they've said they need to know the categories of data that are being processed. And they said they need to know the types of categories of data. So as we said, we have two supervisors in the Web Science DTC, so I'm really interested in understanding what we mean by type of data and category of data. And if I look at it from a computer science perspective, this would look very different to if I look at it from a legal perspective. So first of all, we really need to understand exactly what we mean by categories and types of data. We also need to think about how granular these need to be, because we could look at it, the OECD has categorized data in some ways as provided, observed, inferred, and derived, as I mentioned earlier, but does this really lead to informed consent? Do we talk about it in terms of personal, sensitive, and anonymous data, or do we go deeper into the category of exactly what it is, or the individual bits of data? But the problem is, as we get more granular, actually consent gets even more complex, so we need to do some work around this. And we've been talking about big data, and we were just talking about algorithms, so we also need to think about how this duality really helps when even innocuous data like Facebook likes can be used to predict religious beliefs, ethnic origin, and sexual orientation, or how people's mental models don't actually match up with what can be done with their data. So there was a study showed that 40% of people were happy when they surfed a it was a medical website, for their search terms to be, they would share their search terms entered and their pages visited, but they weren't happy with the medication they were taking being disclosed. And so how do we match up the fact that these two can be done? So in summary, I'm trying to understand why there's a differing requirement as to whether we need to tell people what data we're collecting about them. I want to understand how to address this legally and also how to address this practically. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Emma. So Emma starts off as a lawyer and has been working with computer scientists as well. We also have, oh, it's so exciting. I keep pressing the button and nothing happens. Have we run out of slides? We have, hello? Oh, yes. We have Richard. So Richard started off as a computer scientist and is now working with economists.
Economists and interaction. Psychologists. So, everyone. Okay, right. Yep, so I'm Richard. I should have finished in the DCC by now. I'm also attached to the Meaningful Consent in the Digital Economy project, which is sort of what I want to talk about today. There we go. So why would we talk about consent? So consent is an increasingly important concept in data protection regulation. It's already present in the e-privacy directive, the original one, which is why we have to opt into email marketing, and it should be present in the new general data protection regulations. Consent that we normally see nowadays, when you say consent, people think of the cookie notices. And that's become a bad thing because basically ain't nobody got time for consent anymore. So consent has this bad rep. People say that consent doesn't help, that consent is damaging. And I think that's probably wrong. I think we need to take a broader view of what consent really is and understand what its role will be, because consent doesn't fix everything, but consent is an important part of data protection. If nothing else, because sometimes you can't think of a better legitimate reason to process someone's data, but they may want you to do it. So sometimes you do need to go back to a data subject and say, I'd like to do this, could you just give me permission? And so fundamentally, consent in the digital economy is about giving people a genuine choice in the services that they engage with, and furnishing them with the understanding of what you're going to do and the implications of that choice. And there are more nuanced models about how you actually achieve these two things and the properties of the interactions you need. But those are the two fundamental ingredients, which means that conversely, if your citizens have a genuine choice and they do understand what they're letting themselves in for, that's to say that they're these empowered consumers who are picking which services to engage with, and they have enough education and understanding of the world that they live in to make these decisions, then we've got consent. So typically we think of consent as a means to an end. Consent becomes this way to think about data protection, but equally consent is the end result of having this functional market in which consumers are making and expressing preferences in line with these values that we typically value in Western democracies, so choice, people having some idea of how things work. And so choice and understanding, and hence consent, become this way to deal with the massive trust deficit that exists between consumers and the services that they engage with. Because we see that frequently consumers are reluctantly engaging with a number of reservations. So I do think consent is important. But that's not to say that the consent we have today is working, because I think we all know that it isn't. There's clearly a problem with the consent that we see today, because we see that these supposed consent mechanisms, we use cookies, by closing this message you're agreeing to that, or we assume that you're okay with this, by ticking the box you agree to that. These don't work. And fundamentally, these are one class of consent interaction. These are about notice and consent. These are about telling somebody something and then pretending that they listened, when we know that they didn't. And so in practice today, consent has become about box ticking, and that's true in a quite literal sense, in that we spend a lot of time ticking boxes. And it's true in a figurative sense, in that for organizations who put these things in place, they are going through a box ticking exercise to satisfy requirements imposed by regulators. The fact is, nobody ever got sacked for putting a tick box, even though we know it doesn't work. And so consent has become about creating a legal fiction that your users understand. And sort of by way of example of how pathological this has become, Facebook know how long we spend on every page. Every click on Facebook, and in fact most websites, is instrumented. We know how long you've read something, we know how often you've moved the mouse. Facebook know you didn't read the privacy policy, yet their sign up button says, by clicking this button, you agree you've read it. And so where do we go from here? Well, maybe I would say this, but I think consent is an interaction problem. Consent is necessarily transactional, and it necessarily involves multiple parties coming to some kind of agreement. It means it's not just a legal problem, it's not just a policy problem, it is about interaction design and behavioral science. And actually this means that we can compare the idea of these consent interactions, of consent architectures, with the ideas of choice architecture proposed by Taylor and Sunstein in their work on nudging. So let's reimagine what constitutes a consent interaction with these two properties in mind, that is choice and understanding. And one way to do that is to rethink a little bit about what we mean by consent, as Emma suggested, that let's start thinking of consent as the absence of surprise. So citizens who have given meaningful consent, not just a legal fiction, should not be surprised further down the line. That's the fundamental idea. They may be impoverished, miserable, or imprisoned, but they shouldn't be surprised about it. So the biggest problem in consent then is in making sure that citizens' mental models, that's to say the things users think you're doing with their data, actually match up with what you are doing. Because everywhere those two things don't line up creates the potential for your users to be surprised. And this is sort of non-trivial, because when you start delving into this, you realize you have this huge problem of narrative. So there are multiple ways to explain any given practice, and by way of example, here are 3 different narratives for a very similar thing. You can take a technical narrative to explain what you're doing, and that would be we use cookies. And this is where we're stuck with the cookie law at the moment. We know we use cookies. You can take an intentional view. You can say, this is why we're doing it. So we want to target ads based on your browsing history. That's your intent. Or you can say to your users, actually, this is how it's relevant to you. This is the values that you care about, and this is what this decision has to do with them. So an explanation there might be that actually this targeting might limit the range of products that you've shown, the services or jobs. It might actually reinforce these social inequalities because of our choice of algorithm. And so choosing that correct narrative and helping users to contextualize the risk can become part of consent, and that is an open question about how we do that. But we also see that users are really bad at moving between these levels. Even though it logically follows that using third parties I can track you, you might infer my intent, and you can probably work out if you thought about it hard enough what the consequences might be. We see from the research that we've done in the project that I've done through my PhD that actually users don't make these leaps from one to another. So saying we use cookies, even we use cookies to target ads, isn't good enough. But the promise of formulating consentfulness as this nice metric is that it moves the design of consent mechanisms from this speculative box-ticking exercise, which is how we follow best practice guidelines from the Information Commissioner, into this empirical process that we can iterate around. If you can measure the consentfulness of an interaction you're giving to your users, then engineers can iterate on that, they can improve how they're doing it, and that's the sort of thing that interaction engineers and designers and programmers are really good at. Service providers benefit because given this instrument and methodology for determining the consentfulness of interaction, they can say to a regulator, we can prove 90, 80, 70% of our users got it, that we showed 70% of them understood, compared to 1% of them at the moment. That gives them some legal certainty, and it allows for this innovation because they're no longer constrained by what policymakers and regulators think they need to see. And then the role of the regulator shifts from producing these speculative guidelines about saying this is the checkbox you need to use, to actually just checking that this methodology was carried out properly. And so you end up less with this speculation and more like the health and safety executive who will come in and say, well, actually, did you do your risk assessment properly? Did you prove that your roller coaster was safe? So what do these new interactions look like? I suggest a couple that we're looking at. So the first is this idea of negotiation, that I will negotiate with a service to come to an agreement which necessarily embodies consent, but that I probably don't want to do this myself. But that using an agent, represented by the dog, acting on my behalf, if my software agent knows my preferences, knows what I care about, and knows perhaps something about my personal context and where my risk is, it can negotiate on my behalf to say, this is the data you can have from my personal data store, perhaps this is the data you can't, and what am I going to get in return? It could say to Facebook, look, you're making 20 cents a month from my profile by selling this information to ad brokers. I'll just give you 50p, and then my data will be safe, and it will save you a lot of hassle as well. And that's the sort of negotiation that we'd like to unlock, because actually that allows consumer preference to start acting as a market force. And by involving these semi-autonomous agents, we overcome a lot of the cognitive biases that undermine user decision-making. It doesn't necessarily need to trade off so drastically future risk against short-term gain. And of course, it gives credit for this idea of what I would call reverse expectation alignment. So this is not changing what your user thinks. This is using how your user thinks your service should work and acting like that. It's if your service looks like a duck, you should make it walk and quack like a duck. And then where your practice deviates from user expectations is where you need to inform them about things. You no longer need 20 pages of privacy policy if the only thing that's unexpected is this tiny bit of novelty around, I don't know, who you're selling the data to. And consider doing things just in time. So if I sign up for Facebook and I don't upload any photos for 6 weeks, don't make me consent to your policy around photo copyright or photo privacy when I sign up. Do it when I upload the first photograph. A little regular information is easier to process. And so in summary, consent is a much broader principle than the notice and consent interactions that we have today. Consent is an interaction problem as well as a legal and a policy one. And research towards making measures of consent empirical should provide assurance to business and consumers and allow innovation in this space. Thank you.
So that's really exciting work, which is actually about rethinking, re-engineering the way we think of our web interactions and our web services. But that's not the only one. So we also have Ruben Binns, who's very much been active in this whole notion of personal data and personal data architectures. Ruben, you're supervised by which disciplines?
So Lisa Harris from management, who's sitting over there. I've got a supervisor in computer science and one from law as well. So I've got 3 disciplines to add to the mix. So today I'm just going to be talking about 2 strands of my research. One is a study that I did last year, and the other one is more of a kind of a set of abstract ideas that I've been thinking about alongside my PhD. So I'm going to be talking specifically about consumer profiling. So one way to think about consumer profiling is that it's a way to help match products and services with people who need them. And so this is one of the business models that's driven the web. It's kind of 90% of the revenue of some of the big internet companies, and it's about 20% of the entire ad industry. So this is kind of how it's done at the moment on the web. You've got some sellers on one side who have products and services, and on the other hand, you've got web users who are consumers who they're trying to sell to. In the middle, you've got this really complicated kind of web network of intermediaries who are buying and selling data, who are matching advertisers with publishers, trying to match opportunities to advertise with people who want to advertise. And so this is all done in an algorithmic way, kind of behind the scenes when you click from page to page. So it's kind of a really complicated and quite strange world, but does it actually work? Well, a lot of the times it does work, but then there are also quite a few problems with it. So 44% of the time that an ad is served, it's estimated that it doesn't actually reach the viewer, and so not even appearing on the page. So of the remaining 66% that do, sorry, 56% that do, yeah, they are not necessarily taken in by the user. They might just be simply ignored. Some of the clicks that are made on those ad impressions might be fraudulent as well. And then furthermore, the content of the adverts might not be very good because the profiles that they're based on might be inaccurate. And not just businesses are getting a slightly raw deal here, but also consumers are. There's worries about surveillance and civil liberties that we've heard about today. worries about malware being delivered through these advertising networks, worries that the profiles of consumers will fall into the wrong hands. There's also worries about how what looks like personalization in one context might actually be more like discrimination in another context. And there have been a few studies trying to quantify the effect that this has on marketing. So one study found that when personalization increases, so when you get more personalized adverts, you might pay more attention, but you actually generally find it less acceptable. Another study found that there was actually a 5% reduction in intention to purchase, where a consumer found it kind of creepy that the advert knew that they wanted that thing. So there's actually a real kind of danger of a backlash against this that would affect the business's bottom line. There's actually a parallel here with, I think this was mentioned earlier, the idea of the uncanny valley of personalization. So the thesis from robotics is that when you make a robot a little bit like a human, say Wall-E from the Disney film, people like it, it's cute, but then you get to a certain level and it's too much like a human, like maybe Terminator, and people get scared. And so there's a parallel here with personalization in advertising. If it gets too personal, people start to freak out and find it creepy. So that's what we've got at the moment, behavioral profiling. Profiling that's based on information about someone that's surreptitiously collected about their behavior, and that's used to infer things about what that person might be susceptible to by way of advertising. So what I'm interested in is a different model, which is what you might think of as an individual-centric model, where individuals get to create their own profiles, supplying their own information, and they get to choose which companies get to see those profiles and which don't. And in some cases, some of the startups that are appearing in this space also offer to give the consumer a cut of the ad revenue. So this is what I call the self-authored interest profile model. So I set up a study to study these two kinds of profiling. And specifically, I was interested, so this is a few examples of the companies that are doing this. There's a few in the UK, quite a few in the US, this is one from France. So the aim of the study was to look at these two types of profiling and see what the effect each of them had on propensity to purchase. So an individual's desire to purchase a product that was recommended on the basis of one of these two kinds of profiling. So I wanted to see not just what the difference was, but also why, if there was a difference, why there was a difference. Was it because the content of the recommendations was different? Or was it because people felt that they had a sense of control, that there was transparency in the process? And would that have an effect on their reported interest in the product? So I built two quite crude profiling systems to simulate these two things. One based on Amazon data, so the way that Amazon uses different products that you've bought in the past to predict what you want to buy in future, and then a very simple kind of self-authored interest profile. And so I found that on average, there was a preference for the self-authored model. Interestingly, I also found that this wasn't entirely due to the content of the recommendations. It was actually to do with people's perception of the profile that drove the recommendation. So when they felt like there was the recommendation was based on an inference made on their previous behaviour, their previous purchases, they liked the recommendation slightly less than when they felt that it had come from their own self-authored interest profile. So a few implications of this for industry. First and foremost, it might be worth trying this model as an alternative to the current model of behavioural profiling. And the reason that it might be good is that, one, it can increase the transparency and control, and therefore the trust that people might have in those services, but it can also potentially increase their response, their engagement with the product that's being advertised. So I want to argue that this is actually just one example of what I would call personal data empowerment. The idea being that individuals might be able to control their own data for their own purposes in ways that serve their own interests rather than the interest of the company that's trying to sell them something. So I've been doing some work with Control Shift. Liz, who was speaking earlier, the CEO of Control Shift, talked about the idea of personal information management services. So these are a range of different services that allow people to integrate data about themselves, use that data to make better decisions, to run their lives more effectively, and so on. So I think that this idea is interesting not just because it is an answer to some of the privacy problems we've been discussing, but also because I think it's an answer to a more general problem that we face in modern societies. And I'm going to try and illustrate that problem with a few questions. So, how many of us here feel that we are rational, informed, engaged consumers? How many of us feel that we... Okay, there's a few hands, okay. So I'm starting off with 2. When I ask some more questions, hopefully that will narrow down even further. How many of us feel that we know we're on the best energy deal or the best insurance deal, or that we know that we're on the optimal mobile phone tariff that we could be on? Given that we all use data in different ways, we make calls, we make SMS texts, we travel internationally. How many of us know that we're on the best contract? So only a few hands. And that's not surprising, given that this is the number of permutations of mobile phone contracts that were available in 2011, which is the last time there was a study done on it. So how many of you have looked through 8.5 million mobile phone contracts? I doubt anyone. So that's one aspect of being a rational, informed, engaged consumer that we're expected to be in modern marketplaces. Another aspect is, where are we? This question: are you good at life admin? How on top do you feel of all the things in your life that you're supposed to be on top of? So how many of us read through all of our bank statements to check that all of the charges that have been made to our cards are as we expected, that none of them are erroneous, etc.? How many of us know that if we're paying off debts, we're doing it in the most sort of effective way? How many of us know that when we purchase a flight online, it's not going to be cheaper the next week if we go back and look again? How many of us read the terms of service and the privacy policies that determine our rights when we use online platforms? These are all examples of what I would like to tentatively call consumer bureaucracy. And so I think that potentially PIM's, Personal Information Management Services, might be an answer to this general problem. I've been reading this book recently by a chap called David Graeber, who's an anthropologist at LSE, and his book is called The Utopia of Rules: On Technology, Stupidity, and the Secret Joys of Bureaucracy. And one of his arguments is that in the past, bureaucracy was associated with the state, with public sector, and that it was a symptom of kind of bloated public sector bodies where there was a kind of a tendency to put in forms and procedures and tick boxes rather than to focus on actual outcomes and being efficient. But what Graeber argues is that actually in the last few decades, it's gone the other way. Capitalism has become incredibly bureaucratic. And I think that nowhere is this more true than in the case of consumers. We're expected to go through incredible amounts of bureaucracy just to enjoy the freedoms that we supposedly should enjoy in a free market. The freedom to switch supplier, the freedom to choose the most sort of the product or the service that most effectively meets our individual needs. And so I'd like to suggest that personal information management services are one answer to this problem, an answer to the problem that as consumers we're not rational, we're not choosing the products that are the best fit between our needs, our desires, our values, and the price that we pay for them and so on. So, as well as being an answer to some of the privacy problems we're talking about today, I think personal data empowerment is much bigger than that. It's also about changing the way that consumers engage with markets. And whether that's through startups that offer these services, or governments, or charities, or something else, I think it's an interesting question to focus on. So ask me any questions afterwards.
Thank you. So there's 3 of our students. If you're interested in being involved with any of our students and setting up projects with them, please come and see us. I won't subject them to question and answer sessions, but they have posters outside. And so I'll hand back to Wendy.
Why not start a drink?
Apparently, are the drinks actually served? Are they there? So our gift to you is from each of our students today is an early access to the bar. Thank you very much.